These are hard times for the African American people. They have been taken from their homes and are forced to work on large plantations as slaves. These ordinary people, like you and like me, have been sold and traded like they were nothing but toys. These are the stories of the Civil War. The Civil War by
Dylan Robert Tweed,
Joseph Douglas Miller, and
Nicholas Daniel Shoemaker.
Slaves worked on plantations to pick cotton and do the labor the plantation owners did not wish to do. The life of a slave was full of hard labor and suffering. Some plantations that slaves worked on forced the slaves to build their own housing. Others provided housing allowing the slaves to be free of the hard work of building a house.
Was slavery wrong? If you think about it, slaves were only sentenced to work on plantations to do the hard labor that plantation's owner did not want to do. There were other options that could easily have been done, like hiring workers instead of taking our African people away on ships to force them on these plantations.
In the year 1861, April 12th, the Confederate troops fired cannons at Fort Sumter. When the Union troops at Fort surrendered, Southerners cheered and the Civil War began. The majority of the Union favored a strong government and opposed slavery. The Confederates were the opposite in having slaves as a way of life. The Confederates also opposed Abraham Lincoln for president, and when his election came, it started the secession of the 11 states.
by the year 1860, the amount of slaves almost reached 4 million. This compared to the amount of Americans who were free, which was at 27 million, means that in the year 1860, over 1/10 of the U.S. population was enslaved.
The Civil War ended up turning our nation against itself and leaving over 600,000 U.S. soldiers dead in their tracks.
On April 17, 1861, Virginia seceded from the Union, followed within 5 weeks by Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, thus forming an 11-state confederacy with a population of 9 million, including nearly 4 million slaves. The Union will soon have 21 states and a population of over 20 million.
The Union Army under General Irvin McDowell suffered a defeat at Bull Run, 25 miles southwest of Washington. Confederate General Thomas J. Jackson earns the nickname Stonewall. As his brigade resists Union attacks, Union troops fall back to Washington. This is when President Abraham Lincoln now realizes the war will be longer than thought.
September 17th, 1862. This was one of the bloodiest days in U.S. military history as General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate armies were stopped at Antietam in Maryland by McClellan and outnumbered by Union forces. By nighttime, 26,000 men were either dead, wounded, or missing. Lee withdrew back to Virginia.
On September 22nd, 1862, freeing slaves was put into effect by President Abraham Lincoln.
The Union Army under General Hooker was defeated by Lee's smaller forces at the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia because of his smart and daring tactics. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was mortally wounded by his own soldiers. Union losses are at 17,000. For the Confederates, it is at 13,000.
May 10th, 1863. The South suffered a huge blow when Stonewall Jackson died from his wounds and he uttered his last words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under a shade of trees."
General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Confederate Army on April 9th, 1865 to General Ulysses S. Grant.
The remaining Confederate forces surrender later in May and the country is reunited.
The 13th Commandment was made on December 6, 1865, destroying slavery in the United States of America.